I want to talk about water ethics in practice, and the idea is that there are ethics in everything, and it can make a difference in how we use water. I'm looking at it as an anthropologist. I guess my background is sort of interested in cultural values and how values motivate behavior. And that, so we know that there's always that kind of element that so business has culture. The business hires anthropologists sometimes, both for their own organizations as well as for marketing, to understand kind of what makes people click. And I think we've not really addressed that very well in the water world. But we know that what we're doing isn't really working. So maybe we should look at some of the values that are driving what we're doing, and maybe we should look at some of the values that we would like to have driving what we're doing. So I'm kind of schizophrenic about whether I'm talking about ethics as a descriptive thing, kind of just what are the ethics, just looking at it like a scientist under the microscope, these interesting humans, here's an ethics dimension, or am I prescribing and saying this is what we should be doing? We should be doing sustainability and rights of nature and all that. So I'll be interested in maybe some comments about, does it matter if I'm schizophrenic about that, or how do we handle that difference between prescribing and describing? Because I think it gets us into trouble sometimes when we sound too moralistic. But on the other hand, we have our values, and what do we do with those? So there are three domains of ethics, according to me, and that's how we'll structure this hour. Kind of the environmental side, how ecosystems are managed, and what are the values that go into our decisions about those ecosystems. And the second domain is how water is used. What do we use it for, and what are the values and ethics that kind of motivate that? Like, do we go for industrial agriculture or local agriculture? That's, to me, that's a water issue in the sense that we're using water for industrial agriculture, or we're using water for local community agriculture. Kind of what are the values that around that? And then how water is governed. What are the values we're expressing? And a big one, I think a really huge one, is individual water versus community water. And you see this in development projects. I mean, it's a very live issue in development projects. Are we trying to provide water for the poor and people who don't have access to water? Well, how do we do that? Do we do that through trying to get individuals to drill wells, or private companies, or do we work through communities? Do we try to is the community part of our community capacity building, is that part of our objective in a water project? Or is our objective just to provide water and we don't care about the community side because that's too complicated? And those are also kind of not just practical issues, but moral issues. And I want to start with ecosystem management, and I'll say a little bit, and then Bob will give an example to kind of ground us a little bit, or water us or something. And the kinds of questions that come up in ecosystem management, or what in my mind, I'm thinking river. I'm thinking Rio Grande because that's where I live. But so that's kind of where I'm coming from when I talk about ecosystems. But it could be a wetland, it could be a spring, it could be a lake. So we have the physical side of how are we handling the physical development of the Rio Grande. We channelize it, make it straight, we put in levees, we put in dams, and those are all choices, and they reflect values. And then we divert water from it. We use the water. I mean, right? We have to use water. So how do we meet that have to use water to grow food? How do we do that? And how much do we divert? Do we divert the whole thing? Do we divert just a little bit? I like to use the analogy of the Maasai with their cows. They drink the blood, they let blood out from their cows for food. But they can't let too much out or the cow dies. And they can't let too little out or they die. So, it's that kind of, that's a nice analogy for the river, I think. And then we all know about water quality. I think water quality probably gets more play in our society because it's related to health, and health, as far as I can tell, is our new religion, along with safety. But water quality is a huge issue, and it's not just the water quality of microbes and things. It's the water quality of heavy metals and the legacy of leaching dam sites and stuff. So that's just kind of a framework, and then we have things that are happening. That we've had population growth, so all these dynamics become more concentrated because of more people. And then there's economic development of conventional sort, so that puts more pressure on. And then there's the cultural worldview, our values. This is where I feel that we can do something about that. We can't do that much a society can't do that much about the global population. It can do something. We can't do that much about globalization, but we can do something about what this community wants to believe. You can see that with Bolivia adopting the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. Okay, we can kind of consolidate our worldview. We've always been able to do those things, but we have new complications. We have climate change, kind of, sort of upping the ante a little bit. We have kind of institutional globalization, financial stuff that's its own kind of movement. I keep thinking of David Corton's book, When Corporations Rule the World, which came out, I think, in the early 90s. And it's like, yes, it's actually happening. And we have environmental degradation. So it's not just that we're degrading the environment in the present moment, but we have the legacy of bad things done in the past that are now kind of affecting us in the present. And then we have culture change. Values do change, and we don't litter the way we did 30 years ago. There's a great little film clip from the 50s of somebody having a picnic and then just throwing all their trash in the park and then moving on. And we don't do that anymore. And I think so. It's also good to be aware that values can and do change, so it's not so depressing. And the two things that I want to mention about how we look at ecosystems and where the ethics come into how we handle rivers is what Maud mentioned yesterday, is in one of her 3 principles, is the rights of nature, and how this is just, I think, it's such a simplistic, but I think really fundamentally important idea that, I attribute to Aldo Leopold. It's been around for a while, but it hasn't been really applied to water systems very much. But we need to do that. And the kind of the flip side of the right to water is the right of people to healthy ecosystems. Now, this hasn't been mentioned, but I know the Brazil law, and I guess laws in other countries as well. But I know in Brazil there is a clear, everyone has the legal right, never mind that they don't actually have the actual right, but they have a legal right to healthy rivers. And it's in their, I believe it's in their constitution or it's in their laws. So that there is a legal basis for, I have a claim to this river being healthy, so it's not healthy, so I can sue you. But I don't think that it has that much practical effect, but I think it's an interesting way. It's not just rights of nature, it's rights of people to nature. And just as an example is, I'm not going to go with that because this is what is the Rio Grande and how is it viewed? And this is just a quote from Pueblo Indian interview, just saying how important that river is. But what do we do to it? We build a dam on it. And I don't want to be anti-dam. I'm anti most dams, but I'm not anti all dams. But Cochise Dam is a huge eyesore, and it's basically for flood control. And it doesn't need to be for flood control. There are other ways of managing floods. And it just, anyway, there's a long history. It's a real interesting one. But I just have a picture of it to show you what. And then these jacks, they're called jetty jacks, were dumped along the Rio Grande banks, hundreds of thousands of them in the 50s and 60s. even up to the 70s, by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to stabilize the channelized banks. It just to kind of, it's like a snow fence for the river. And now there's a program to take them out because they realize they haven't really done much good. And it's something that you wouldn't do if the river is sacred. You don't like throw all this stuff on the edges of the banks. Nor do you build a wall along the border. But so from the Rio Grande, we're going to switch to Nepal, and I'll turn it over to Bob, and then we'll do a little back and forth.
Back and forth. Dave and I haven't linked up on a presentation for 20 years, so
bear with us.
We're a little rusty on this, and we spend all our time together catching up and not getting coordinated. So bear with us, but I think it will all fit together here. What I want to do, well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm an engineer, and I have a real passion for trying to solve real problems. And I like technology, I like gadgets, but I've learned over the years that solutions to problems don't really come about by technology and gadgets. They start by getting people together. And they end, and they get solved by people coming up with solutions. Yes, technology can be a part of that solution or a tool in that solution, but it's not the solution. So I don't want to emphasize here the technologies that went into this example, but rather how people came together to solve a problem. The example I want to give is about a power project in Nepal. I lived in Nepal for about 15 years, so I decided my best examples came from there rather than my most recent time, which was in Ethiopia. But I want to give a little bit of background first on on what the issue of irrigation is all about in a remote area or in remote areas of Nepal. It means accessing water to grow more food. Communities face a problem of not being able to support their population. And one alternative is if they can bring water to the land and grow more food, it means they can stay there a bit longer. So all over the world, really, and particularly in mountainous countries, communities have come together to build some kind of a diversion system on a stream and lead the water through a canal to their fields. Now, obviously, the fields that are pictured here aren't the ones that are getting water from this canal, but it illustrates what the fields look like. In this case, they're designed for growing rice. But they have intensified their cropping system by moving from rice in the rainy season, when irrigation is just supplemental, to wheat and then corn in the other 2 seasons of the cropping year at the lower elevations. So this looks like a technological piece of work. You build a diversion, you have a canal. But often it involves a tremendous amount of labor, bringing a canal like this to their fields. An individual can almost never do it by themselves. And so the community, or the community of users, has to come together and invest a lot of work and a lot of labor. And it's not just building the system, it's then operating it. You can imagine, these are just stones piled up. First flood that comes along, it's going to disappear, which means it has to be rebuilt. So how does that happen? How do you mobilize the labor to do that work? That requires governance. And ultimately, that's what this is all about, is governance. How do communities interact and work together to accomplish the tasks that they've set for themselves? So this is the case I want to talk about. This is a hydropower project that is just a small diversion dam, water directed into a tunnel coming out on the other side of the ridge, an opportunity for 250 meters of head to generate electricity. This small plant here is 5 megawatt, not much bigger than some of the wind turbines we see along the road nowadays, but is an example of a pretty appropriate project in a remote area of Nepal. The project was proposed by a private company. And the private company came up with a plan and sold it to the government. This is what we could do if you give us the opportunity to work with this. The input to the private company also came from people who were interested in appropriate types of project development, and put some brakes on it when it was clear that the company intended to build the power project and sell the electricity, and perhaps there would be no benefits in the local community. So they said, how can we involve the community in doing something that's useful for their livelihoods? And it's that process of coming up with that solution that I want to go into a bit, but I'll come back to that after a few minutes while I describe. This is the outlet end of the tunnel, right at the point where 80% of the water is dropped down through a shaft into the turbines to generate the power. The other 20% is being distributed as irrigation to this community. And this was the negotiations and the process that took place to make that happen. And this is just a quick attempt at just giving a little bit of an idea of what this looks like. So here's a small stream, the Andicola River. From the point of where the water is taken out of the stream, it's about 15 kilometers to this larger river, way downstream. And then this larger river meanders another 45 kilometers to get back to where it's only about 5 kilometers across here. And with a 1.5 kilometer long tunnel, they were able to divert part of the water from the stream to the other side of the watershed. And so the hydropower is going down a shaft, coming out down here. The water is coming out down here, so it's not accessible for irrigation. There's some upstream, downstream water issues that I'm not going to go in at this point, but there was a lot of time spent making sure there was no impact on upstream users or downstream users. But what I want to talk about is how this irrigation system evolved. A canal was proposed to be built in both directions from the outlet and to irrigate these small patches that you see here. I'll come back to that. Let me just make sure I didn't skip something out. Okay, so I'm going to let you pick up from there, and then I want to come back to it and talk about the governance and how that all came about.
Okay, so we're in an agriculture example, and that's I find it very helpful to me to think of different sectors, different categories of where morals, ethics, values come into our decision making. And I think we have a lot of people here talking about local versus industrial farming, and that's a big issue. But to me, that's a water issue, as I mentioned earlier. And social welfare is also kind of a dimension of water. Who's benefiting from the water that we use in our agriculture? So that's not only if those are ethical questions related to water use, as well as the environmental sustainability. So take the example that Bob just gave. If you divert too much water out of the stream to connect with the river downstream and get all that head, that there's a trade-off. And if there's plenty of water, maybe there's no impact. There's always some impact. There's going to be some impact on fish and wildlife. But I think it's a question, as Obama said in the budget debates, it's a question of balance. So we have to balance these trade-offs and know that what one person's balance is another person's extreme environmentalism. So those what determines that? Those are values that we give to it. So to me, that's where we have room to address what are the ethics that in a given situation, what ethics are being exhibited, manifest? What are we walking? Are we walking our talk? And is our talk, our values, our ethics that are being expressed in a particular case, is that what we want to express? I think in the case of those jacks along the Rio Grande, those ugly things, that's, nobody supports those things anymore. But nobody really thought twice. It wasn't controversial when it was done in the 50s and 60s. So it helps, I think, to keep thinking about what values are we expressing with our actions, because everything's changing. The environmental consequences of those jacks now in that river of the Rio Grande are different than in the 50s, because the river is behaving differently. There's a dam upstream that wasn't there in the 50s. And so hydrologically, it's a different river. Socially and morally, ethically, it's a slightly different community making those decisions. But I think there's a built-in time lag between we do things. I'll give an example from Santa Fe. The enlightened Santa Fe city has a dammed up river with no environmental flow. And it's always been accepted. That's just sort of the way Santa Fe has grown up over the last 100 years. The first dam was in the 1880s, and dams got successfully bigger, and suddenly the whole river was dry most of the year, but people kind of got used to it, and so that's kind of normal. So now we have a campaign in Santa Fe to try to introduce the concept of environmental flow to our river, which just sounds so incongruous. Like, why do you have to introduce the concept of environmental flow? It's illegal not to have environmental flow in most countries, in all of Europe. You can't do that. You can't do in Europe, even in Greece and Spain, which is dry, you can't do what we're doing in Santa Fe. But it's not that the people in Santa Fe are that ignorant, but they just have, there's a lag between their current ethics would opt for having environmental flow, but they've just kind of gotten used to it. So there's a disconnect between the current values and the existing situation. To me, that's what a study of ethics, just the descriptive part of ethics, can help us with, is saying, let's look for kind of logical gaps between what we're doing and what we would like to be doing, and see how we can fill them up. But another area where you see this a lot is water conservation, urban industrial use. So water conservation's a big thing now. We'll conserve water, we'll use low-flow toilets and low-flow shower heads, and we'll put in curb cuts to let the rainwater go into infiltrate into the groundwater and all these things. And that's great, and we should be doing that. But what are we trying to accomplish in doing that? And what are the values driving that? And you get lots of different values that are actually conflicting that might support the same technology, like wastewater reuse. Are we doing it so that we can have more water to have more expansion of our city? Or are we doing it so we can continue to have home gardens and stuff? Or are we doing it to protect the natural environment? Where does our environmental responsibility or sense of stewardship, what part does that play? And if you interview people who are conserving water, like why they're conserving water, they'll give you different reasons. And I think it's helpful, I think, to analyze what those reasons are. And we might, through looking at the reasons given, the values, we might come up with new ideas of how we can make the whole system work better. The water footprint, industrial water use is a huge area, and by industrial I'm including mining, extractive, so fracking, manufacturing, any kind of industry that uses water, I lump under here. And the standard kind of best practice at the moment is water footprint analysis to try to use less water. Ford announced a month ago that they're going to use, their target is 30% less water in their total water consumption. I don't think for manufacturing and transportation and the whole kind of life cycle of building their cars. Well, that's great. I mean, I think that should be applauded. But to me, it's not just enough. It's not enough. There's more that companies can do besides water footprinting, and there's more that municipalities can do besides water conservation. Somehow we have to turn the corner of using the water only for ourselves and giving some back to nature in ways that really help nature. So water footprint will make more water available to use for something. What do we do with it? Do we put it back in the river? Do we not take it out of the river, or do we use it for expansion? And in Santa Fe, we had a controversy a couple years ago when the city started a rebate program for just for low flow utilities, front loading washers. They'd already done toilets, so it was front loading washers, shower heads, and they didn't do rooftop harvesting with this rebate program. But there are a few things you get rebates for, and then the city was going to create kind of water credits out of that saved water. They calculate how much water has been saved by your by the low water use appliances that you have purchased with their rebate program. And they calculate that water credit, and then they sell that water credit to businesses that want to move into Santa Fe and need water. And so the environmental community was trying to broker a deal saying, okay, let's divide that saved water at least 50-50, 50% for the river and 50% for development. And it didn't get any traction. And I think it didn't get traction, probably not, I don't think the values were all that screwed up, but I think the way we presented it wasn't all that clever, so we didn't, well, but those are the kinds of value choices I think we're going to get more and more of, is we need to squeeze our water demand down. What do we do with the saved water? And how do we accommodate the needs of nature with our own needs for expansion of development in some way, but so there are lots of trade-offs. And then the cross-sectoral allocation, big issue here, right? Is our water going to be used for agriculture, or is it going to be used for urban? And then what kind of agriculture, what kind of urban? And who decides what kind of agriculture and urban, all those things. But just that question of, are we going to put it under the agriculture side of the column or under the urban industrial side of the column? And on the Rio Grande, we have an Intel plant north between Albuquerque and Santa Fe that uses lots of water. But that water, so that's a little bit controversial, they're using lots of water. But the value of the water that they use is something like, it's several hundred times more valuable per unit of water in terms of the economic benefits, the economic returns on that water, than compared with alfalfa farming, which is the dominant user of water in the middle of Rio Grande. It's alfalfa. And what does alfalfa give you? I mean, it looks nice. It's good for horses. But those are real issues.
Wait a minute. Alfalfa is used to raise beef and animals and the food you eat unless you're a complete vegetarian. So
not much.
Right, but
Not much.
you can
It's still the most important.
anyway. The dollar value is a couple $100s per acre versus like several $100,000 per acre foot of water, that kind of thing. You know, if you do the economic returns of alfalfa water versus that. But in the Rio Grande, we don't have water. I mean, the water that Santa Fe and Albuquerque are drinking is being diverted from the Colorado River system. I don't know if you know that. There's a interbasin transfer from across the Colorado-New Mexico border, which doesn't really make any sense, but it makes historical sense, but not modern sense. So we're growing, in a sense, we're growing alfalfa in the Rio Grande with water that's diverted from the Colorado River. So, but those kinds of issues are usually looked at either economically or legally, and water rights or water economics. And what I'm suggesting is that we can also look at them in terms of values. And here's where I get schizoid again, is we can look at to see what values are being exhibited in this policy, and we can look at what values should be exhibited, which is a lot more controversial. But even identifying what the values are is not so easy, but I think it's a good exercise. Okay, let me just keep going here. We're back to Nepal.
But we're going to introduce a new case here, and then I'll come back to the one about the power project, because this seemed to fit better at this location. First, just a little bit of background. In most countries of the world nowadays, domestic water supply and sewerage, whatever relates to domestic populations, is usually dealt with by one agency in the government. And hydropower is dealt with by another agency in the government. And irrigation is dealt with by a third organization or agency in the government. And those very seldom talk to each other. And certainly don't usually. It's changing in parts of the world, and I would say this is maybe more a situation still in developing countries like Nepal, that those organizations really don't cooperate on developing projects. So I was working for the International Development Enterprise organization based here in Denver, but responsible for projects around the world. And one of the projects that we were part of was called Multiple Use Water Services. And our team in Nepal their responsibility was to find ways that small landowners in the mountains of Nepal could find better ways to grow high-value crops that they could market and earn greater income than they can from rain-fed crops. So they introduced drip irrigation, really small, very low-cost drip irrigation that small farmers could use. Well, drip irrigation is great, but you still have to have water. And so they looked for water. Where do you find water in the mountains? Well, it's streams and springs. Springs, okay. But the spring is off in the forest somewhere, and the land that you could irrigate is over here, and the spring may be used for drinking water already. So over the years, there have been lots of projects to develop drinking water systems, domestic water supply, for villages in Nepal. World Bank had 3 or 4 loans, Asian Development Bank 3 or 4 loans, probably $200 to $300 million funneled through the government of Nepal to build drinking water systems. They have very strict design criteria. In a community, 20 liters per second per person in the village, that's what the system is designed for. 20 liters per, not 20 liters per second, 20 liters per day per person. And so you calculate how many people, you know how much water you need, you design your piping system, you bring the water to the village and let it be distributed from there. And so when IDE staff went and looked for water, they discovered, the overflow from the drinking water system is the best available water supply close to where people need it in their fields, but it's very limited. And then they started investigating why it's limited. Well, it's because the pipe is very limited. The spring may not, but in many springs had a lot more water than was being delivered to the village. So let's see if we can't put bigger pipe in and coordinate this. Well, IDE is a non-governmental organization, didn't bother with the Domestic Water Supply Agency or the Department of Irrigation. They simply went to the community and said, hey, you don't have a good drinking water system here. Are you interested in one? All the women are very interested because it's their responsibility to carry the water. The men weren't very interested because, what's in it for us? Nothing. But 50% of the village is very interested. And then the ID staff said, well, what if you got irrigation out of this? Whoa, suddenly you had 100% interest in it. And then it really started mobilizing people to look at what are solutions in our community for using this water supply in that spring up there to enable us to better utilize that resource for the needs we have in the village. And what I really found satisfying in this was that there was recognition by our staff, by the ID staff in Nepal, that domestic water really is probably the highest priority. If you don't have a good water supply for drinking and bathing and washing, you're in trouble. And if there's leftover water and it can be used for irrigation, and if you can find a mechanism for distributing that so that everyone benefits, then you have a win-win situation. So they came up with a very simple technology. Pipe all the water that's available, as long as it's not infringing on other people's rights that might have been using that spring, pipe all the water that's available and put it in this bigger tank. And that's the drinking water tank. So water is distributed from that once, twice, 3 times a day, whatever the users decide on. And the overflow of that goes into the second tank, from which it can then be distributed to the users who want to use it for irrigation. Well, coming up with that solution is not simply coming in and saying, this is what you can do it like we say, and it'll work. It's rather spending many days sitting down with the community and saying, what are your ideas? What are the options you see? Here's an example of what was done in another village, and there's a different example from that village. Can you put something together here that would work? We're not going to fund it. Well, there was some subsidy. There was ID put in some money. But you're going to have to fund it. You can do all the work to build it. You still need cash for pipe and other things. So you're going to have to raise money from somewhere. And the exciting thing about this project was that it really did mobilize communities to solve their water problem jointly, to put together a mechanism that would keep it operating in the future, and gave them experience in fundraising that also brought other projects to their community, which was a pretty amazing part of the project that we hadn't really anticipated when that was started.
That's me. Again, then the last category that we'll talk about is water governance and the ethical issues that come into play in governance. And in irrigation, a big one is what, well, actually in all of them, is what role do stakeholders play, and what kinds of roles can they play? In irrigation development, there's kind of some tension between working with individual farmers versus working with communities, and as I mentioned earlier, to what extent is community capacity building seen as a goal of a water project, in addition to providing irrigation water or drinking water. And I think that logic applies to irrigation as well as drinking water. And because there's so much emphasis on drinking water right now because of the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, and there's so much money and attention being focused on operationalizing the UN declaration that water is a human right. I think that question of multiple use, not just multiple use, but multiple objectives, is a really important one, which has a moral, ethical layer to it. If we have an opportunity to help the community socially, shouldn't we use a new drinking water scheme as a way of developing the capacity, promoting gender rights and promoting equity of the poorest, and making sure that the poor are part of the whole package. So those are to me ethical issues of governance. And then at the watershed level, you get more of the environmental ethics coming in, as well as the social and equity issues of how are decisions made about the Rio Grande or the South Platte. Who makes those decisions, and what values and ethics are being represented in those decisions. And then back to Nepal.
And you have something to finish up on
Yeah.
after this thing. Okay. Okay, so I'll try to wrap this up rather quickly, but what I want to look at is how this whole irrigation opportunity for a community that had no irrigation water supply in the past, how do they determine how they were going to utilize, allocate, manage this new resource? And I was peripherally involved in the inception of the hydropower project. And I was in Nepal most of the time when that about a decade worth of work was done in bringing this into operation, and had contact periodically, but I had no responsibility other than to provide information and support. But it was a fascinating process to me, because the person who was responsible for designing the irrigation input took my advice. He took 4 years to work with the community of users, of potential users, the larger community in the area, to sit with them, talk with them about what the options might be, take them around the country to visit other projects, to look at government-built projects and the problems they had, to look at farmer-built projects and the problems they faced, and to come up with their own ideas of how to make this work. And what was fascinating to me was that very quickly the people recognized that physically only fields that are under the canal will get water from the canal. So everyone that lives above the canal or has their fields above the canal aren't going to be participants. So what's in it for us? And the long and short of it is the solution they came up with in the end, I'm not sure what I show here, was, okay, let's find a way that everyone will benefit at least a little bit. And their solution was that they would do the labor in building the canal, because there was a grant from Norway to do the construction of the canal. So there's money there to pay to do the construction. Okay, we'll do the labor, and you pay us. So everyone earns a little bit of money, and anyone in the community can come and work to build the canal. So everyone benefits from some increased income. But in addition, everyone that works on the canal is earning a share of water. Now this is where I disagree with a little bit with what we heard, that transferable water shares are not good, because in some cases they can be. So everyone who's working on the system is earning a share of the water, regardless of whether you have a field that can be irrigated. And when it's all done and everything is working, the expectation was that there would be a huge water shortage, that there would be a lot more potential for irrigation than there was water available, and therefore the shares of water would become very valuable. And the community sat together and discussed this for hours and days and months, actually years. How are we going to make this work? How are we going to control it? They elected a committee, they with representation from inside the potential planned area and outside, and they put together the rules they were going to live by. They wrote them down, and they signed them. Everybody in the area, not just the potential water users. And that has been held somewhat sacred as a trust that they have built, they have bought into. And so the idea was that if you have a water right, but you don't have land that can be irrigated by the canal, well, you can try to find land that you can buy. And in fact, they set up a land trust to exchange small holdings of land for water rights, and they're a fairly complicated situation. And the other opportunity was to sell your water to someone who has land that needs more water. The system's now been operating for about 10 years. There's been almost no transfer of water rights. The people with water rights that don't have land to irrigate still haven't really realized any benefit from their water rights. They still own them, and maybe someday there'll be a water shortage. But right now there's been more water than they were expecting, and so that push for transferring the water rights hasn't happened. But what's intriguing to me is the fact that they all are aware of the situation, and they have accepted it as a community. You know, we don't have land down there, it's really too bad, but someday in the future we may benefit from it, and they're very interested in holding on to the water. And this has really pulled that community together, which was very divided before, but now have a common goal of making this system work. What I want to emphasize is that if people are given an opportunity and are given exposure to all kinds of potential solutions, that they will come up with an idea that fits their own ecological, social, cultural, religious goals and values and build that into their solution. This is a farmer-built irrigation system, and they came up with a very simple device for accurately sharing their water. In this case, it wasn't transferable water shares. The water right is based on the land area, but there are 4 canals leaving this spot, and each of those canals has a certain amount of land holding, and the size of the width of the notch is proportional to the land holding that's below the notch. So the water gets divided very simply. It's very visual. In fact, once a year, just as the rice is needing irrigation, this community comes together, this community of users, which is about 20 farmers, does the maintenance on the canal, meets here, and looks at this proportioning weir, confirms that it's accurate, that it's level, that one side isn't getting more water than another, that the widths haven't been changed by anyone, and they agree, okay, from today on, no one dare touch this thing. And no one has a right to complain. If they don't show up for the meeting, they have no right to complain if they somehow lost out. But it's that kind of community commitment that makes it work. Well, this is the Andakula Hydro Project irrigation command area that you see. The spots there that are growing rice across the river as well as this side of the river are all being fed from this new resource that became available because of the hydropower project.
Okay, I'm just going to skip over this and wrap up with just some questions. I guess we don't have time for discussion, but questions after this session. Examples of new ethics being implemented in actual projects. I wanted to ask this in the session before and then this morning. I didn't get a chance, but and to what are the downstream impacts? Since this is a downstream neighbor, downstream impacts of these high-level declarations, the right to water as a human right, the rights of Mother Earth. So, remember the Walter Mondale campaign? Where's the beef? How does that actually play out? And then I think a recurrent theme for this conference is how does ethical change happen? So I'm just going to stop there, and I guess we have a few minutes for discussion. Comments?
I guess a very broad question. As we look at the South Platte area, we're dealing with a very large metropolitan population, agricultural base, downstream rights into Nebraska and beyond. How do we hook these ethical principles into very large institutional structures and political structures? Do you have suggestions about the places where we start to shift the sense of stakeholders and rights and how these ethical principles apply?
Well, I have an academic answer to that. I mean, the reason I started the Water Culture Institute and the Water Ethics Network, which I invite you to look at, waterethics.org, and there's a newsletter, a monthly newsletter you can subscribe to, is that I think that I've always felt, and I'm starting to question it, that if we can draw attention to the fact that there are ethics at working, whether people are aware of it or not, there are values being expressed, you better find out what they are, that can help. There's a play by a Renaissance play about this bourgeois. It's called the Bourgeois Gentleman. It's a French play about this rich guy. I mean, he becomes wealthy, but he's not educated, and he hires a tutor to help him become kind of educated. And the tutor tries to instruct him about grammar, and he said, what's grammar? And the tutor said, well, you use that you've been using that all along. That's how you speak. And the guy's all impressed, like, oh, I have grammar. You know, that he's already been doing it. And I think that's the point about ethics, is that we have ethics. They might be screwed up. They might not fit with even what we ourselves think we should be doing. They might not fit with what the community thinks we should be. But it's an area of contention. And even whether alfalfa is justified or not, regardless of the answer to that question, there are ethics that are being exhibited by using water to grow alfalfa, to grow beef. That's what are the values that we are rewarding in that context? What are the values that we're rewarding with the Intel plant? Is that good for our society? Is that what we want to be doing? So I feel that, call me naive, call me idealistic, but I think that just an awareness is helpful. And we have big corporations talking about ethics, like Coke talks about ethics, water ethics. And water ethics is a big issue among the corporations. You don't hear it from the public sector agencies, the USBR or the Army Corps. They talk about planning. They don't talk about ethics. And I think to pretend that our planning doesn't reflect ethics is deluding ourselves, and we're going to have bad planning. Sorry.
Can I just add a little bit? I think that's a really good question, and certainly I keep asking myself, okay, I've got these good examples from Nepal and other countries where it worked. But can that be applied to the Front Range issues? The order of magnitude is 100 times, and you don't get that number of people together in a room and sit and talk for a whole day. So how do you make that kind of commitment to involving everyone work? I think that's what this meeting is about. And I think that's what we have a shared responsibility to become involved in those issues. And not just from the sideline taking pot shots, but committed to putting the time into looking at all sides of the issue. The one thing that worries me the most is that some people, corporations and governments, believe that we need a solution today. We can't wait to do this or do that. Hey, that oil's been in the ground for a very long time. It's going to be there for a lot longer, whether we take it out of the ground this week, next year, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now. Let's just make sure we're making the right decision. The same applies to the water use. It was very simple when it was only ditch companies that were taking water. Municipalities grew, and they need a lot more water, and it's a very, very complicated situation, but one that we shouldn't shirk at becoming involved in and everyone participating.
I think we have to close the session, right? Thanks for your attention, and we're around if you want to talk.